The women's liberation movement was a political alignment of women and feminist intellectualism that emerged in the late 1960s and continued into the 1980s, primarily in the industrialized nations of the Western world, which effected great change throughout the world. The women fought for equality, intending to free women of the oppression and male supremacy that dominated the society at the time, both within the workplace but also at home. The movement consisted of women's liberation groups, advocacy, protest formed by young women. The liberation aspect of the word means, of course, individual freedom for every woman, but it also resonates with the solidarity among women seeking independence and ending suppression for women collectively. Unfortunately, there were some conflicts born within the movement because there were many different feminist groups who were part of the movement, and these groups held different beliefs about organizing tactics with structure and leadership. The idea of full equality and partnership being expressed in a lack of structure is credited by many with the weakening power and influence of the movement. Furthermore, they also differed on whether working within the patriarchal establishment could effectively bring about desired change.
The movement, which began in US, gained support from women all over the world and spread to places like Canada. But movements also developed in Europe, in countries like Denmark, France, England, Germany, and also reached Australia and Asia.
During the Second World War, approximately 350,000 women joined the military, where they worked as nurses, drove trucks, repaired airplanes, and performed clerk work to free up men for combat. However, after the war was over, the women returned to the role of being solely housewives. But as time progressed, they became more educated and joined the workforce. However, their home responsibilities remained largely unchanged. Though families became increasingly dependent on dual incomes, women still carried most of the responsibility for domestic work and care of children. The women's liberation movement was the first time that the idea of challenging sexism gained wide acceptance. In 1973, the US Supreme Court decriminalized abortion nationwide. This was possibly a consequence of the fact that the women's liberation movement highly emphasized a woman's right to choose, and to be in charge of her own body. Also, before the women's liberation movement, women's participation in history was largely unknown, even to trained historians. Women's roles in historic events were not covered in academic text and not taught in schools. Even the fact that women had been denied the vote was something few university students were aware of in the area. Therefore, women's liberation movement launched women's studies programs introducing feminist history, sociology, and psychology to higher education and adult education.
Women's equal rights advocates like Gloria Steinem, Susan Brown-Miller, and Kate Millard emerged and became the faces and voices for a generation. Gloria Steinem is a writer, speaker, activist, and feminist organizer. She became nationally recognized as a leader and spokesman for the American feminist movement in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. Susan Brown-Miller is an American feminist, journalist, author, and activist. In 1968, Brown-Miller co-founded the New York Radical Feminist. During her work for a 1971 Speak Out, Brown-Miller so radical revised her own opinions on rape that she began drafting the book Against Our Will, which became her most famous book.
The term women's slip was used largely by those who opposed the movement as a way of minimizing, belittling, and making a joke of it. The movement was also largely criticized for being man-hating. The movement sprung out of the fact that these young women lived in a period with rapid social and cultural changes, and these changes made the women question the conditions of their lives and their relationship with men. Many of the women who participated in the women's liberation movement were also active in the civil rights movement, which was a big theme during the 60s.